Can I ever find true love?
No one knew that the young man sitting on the cracked pavement beside the bus stop that Monday morning once signed checks that could change lives overnight. His clothes were faded, his sandals worn thin, and his face carried the quiet exhaustion of someone the city had already forgotten. People passed him without looking twice. Some tightened their grip on their bags. Others pretended he didn't exist. What they didn't know was that this was exactly how he wanted it. Because for the first time in his life, Adewale Adebayo wanted the truth. If you enjoy stories about love, truth, and second chances, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss what happens next. At 28, Adewale had everything society said a man should want. He was a billionaire by inheritance and by brilliance, the sole son of a late oil magnate whose name still carried weight in boardrooms across Lagos. He lived in a glass mansion overlooking the Atlantic, drove cars most people only saw online, and moved with security wherever he went. Yet every night, when the noise died down and the gates were locked, he felt an emptiness that money had never been able to touch. Every relationship he had ever known felt rehearsed, smiles that came too quickly, compliments that sounded like negotiations, love that seemed conditional on what he could provide. Women loved his lifestyle, his influence, his generosity. But no one ever seemed to love Adewale himself, and the thought haunted him more than any business loss ever could. His father had died when Adewale was only 19, leaving him a fortune and a legacy that felt more like a burden than a blessing. From that moment, Adewale noticed how people changed around him. Childhood friends suddenly had business proposals. Distant relatives appeared with urgent needs. Every conversation felt like it had an agenda hidden beneath the surface. He tried dating, hoping to find someone genuine, but each relationship followed the same painful pattern. The excitement in their eyes when they learned his last name. The careful way they dressed for every occasion as if auditioning for a role. The subtle suggestions about trips, gifts, investments in their dreams. And when he tried to have real conversations about fears, doubts, or the weight of expectations, their eyes would glaze over, waiting for him to finish so they could return to safer, more profitable topics. The breaking point came one evening at a private dinner arranged by his aunt. The woman seated beside him laughed too loudly at everything he said, her hand resting comfortably on his arm, already discussing destinations she wanted them to visit together. She spoke about Paris in the spring, Dubai in the winter, and how she had always dreamed of someone who could show her the world. When she excused herself to take a call, Adewale overheard her whispering excitedly into her phone, talking about how she had finally hit gold and that her friends wouldn't believe her luck. She giggled as she described the mansion, the cars, and the potential for a life she had always imagined. Adewale felt something break inside him that night. Not anger, but a deep, aching sadness. He realized he had become a prize to be won, not a person to be known. That night, he returned home and sat alone in his massive living room, staring at the city lights, asking himself a question he had avoided for years. If he had nothing, would anyone still choose him? The question echoed in the silence. He thought about his mother who had died when he was 7, and how she used to tell him that real love was the only thing money couldn't buy. At the time, he hadn't understood. Now, sitting in a house filled with expensive emptiness, her words made perfect sense. That question became an idea, and the idea became a decision that shocked even the people closest to him. Adewale spent 3 days planning carefully. He called his most trusted lawyer and his head of security. He told them he was taking a 30-day personal retreat and that his movements were not to be tracked publicly. His accounts would continue running, his businesses managed as usual by the board he had appointed, but for 1 month he would disappear. His lawyer protested, warning him about the risks. His head of security thought he was having a breakdown, but Adewale was resolute. He needed to know what life looked like from the other side. He needed to understand how the world treated people who had nothing. No assistance, no luxury, no safety net. He withdrew a small amount of cash, enough to survive if spent carefully, but not enough to buy comfort. He handed over his phone, his watches, his designer clothes. He packed a small bag with the simplest items he could find, basic clothes that looked like they had seen better days. Before dawn on the appointed day, Adewale walked out of his estate alone, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. His guard wanted to follow, but Adewale insisted on going alone. The heavy gates closed behind him, and for the first time in years, no one was watching his back. By nightfall, Adewale Adebayo was no longer a billionaire. He was just another homeless man on the streets of Lagos. The first night shattered every assumption he had about strength. He found a spot under a bridge where other homeless people gathered. The ground was hard. The air smelled of decay and exhaust fumes. Mosquitoes attacked relentlessly. He had never realized how loud the city was at night, how every sound felt amplified when you had no walls to protect you. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by fear and discomfort. He woke several times, checking that his small bag hadn't been stolen, aware that everything he had could disappear in seconds. The first few days were brutal. Hunger came faster than he expected. By the second day, the modest breakfast he had eaten before leaving felt like a distant memory. His stomach cramped. His head ached. He understood why people fought over scraps. The nights were louder, colder, and lonelier than any boardroom he had ever walked into. He learned quickly that people didn't ignore homeless men because they were cruel, but because acknowledging them felt uncomfortable. It was easier to pretend they didn't exist. Shop owners chased him away when he lingered too long outside their doors. Drivers rolled up their windows when he approached at traffic lights. Children stared with curiosity, then were pulled away by their parents with warnings whispered loud enough for him to hear. Each rejection chipped away at him, but it also sharpened his resolve. This was the truth he had come to find. On the third day, Adewale tried to buy food from a small restaurant. The owner looked him up and down with suspicion, demanded to see his money first, then counted it twice before reluctantly preparing the meal. When Adewale sat down to eat, other customers moved to different tables. He ate quickly, feeling the weight of their stares, and left before finishing. He began to understand the invisible walls that separated people, how quickly judgments were made, how poverty made you a threat before you even opened your mouth. On the fourth day, exhaustion and hunger made him careless. He fell asleep on a bench in a public park and woke to find someone going through his bag. Adewale grabbed it back instinctively, and the thief ran off, cursing him. Shaken, Adewale realized how vulnerable he truly was. Without money, without status, he was just another target. That night he questioned his decision. Maybe this experiment was foolish. Maybe some truths weren't worth discovering. But something kept him going, a stubborn need to see it through. On the fifth day, something unexpected happened. As Adewale sat near a small roadside food stall, watching customers eat and trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in his stomach, a woman approached him. She wasn't dressed extravagantly, just neatly with a calm presence about her. Her headscarf was simple but clean, her smile genuine. Her name was Zainab. She ran a modest bookshop not far from there and passed that route every evening on her way home. Without asking questions, she handed him a wrapped portion of jollof rice and a bottle of water. No lectures, no judgment, just a simple smile and a quiet, "Take care." Adewale was so surprised he almost forgot to say thank you. He watched her walk away, wondering what made her different from everyone else who had passed him by that day. That moment stayed with him long after she walked away. He ate the rice slowly, savoring not just the food but the unexpected kindness. For the first time since the experiment began, someone had seen him as human. Zainab began stopping by every few days, sometimes with food, sometimes with a bottle of water or a piece of fruit, sometimes just to sit nearby and talk. She asked about his past, but never pressed when he kept his answers vague. Adewale told her his name was simply Whale, a man who had lost his way. She listened without pity. She didn't try to fix him or convert him or use him to feel better about herself. She spoke about her own life, about her late mother, who had raised her alone after her father left, about running the bookshop alone, inheriting it after her mother's death, and fighting to keep it alive in a city where people read less and less, about the struggles of keeping hope alive in a place that constantly demanded more than you had to give. She talked about the customers who came to her shop, not for books, but for conversation. The elderly man who came every Tuesday to read newspapers he couldn't afford to buy. The university student who studied in the corner for hours, purchasing only a single pen. She never asked them to leave. Her shop was a refuge and she protected it fiercely. What intrigued Adewale was how normal everything felt with her. She didn't see him as a project. She didn't try to fix him. She treated him like a human being worthy of conversation and companionship. As the days passed, Adewale noticed something else. When Zainab wasn't around, the world went back to being cold. People were generous only when they thought someone was watching. Offers came with conditions. Kindness often came with suspicion. He received charity a few times, meals from religious organizations or donations from passers-by. But it always came with something else. A sermon he was expected to sit through, a lecture about getting his life together, a judgment about what had brought him to this point. Charity, he realized, often made the giver feel good while making the receiver feel small. But Zainab's presence was different. It was steady, unforced, real. She never asked for his story in exchange for her kindness. She never made him feel like he owed her anything. One evening, as they sat together near her bookshop after closing time, she asked him something unexpected. "Whaley, do you think people are born good or do they learn it?" Adewale thought about it carefully. "I think people are born with the capacity for both. But life teaches them which one is safer." Zainab smiled. "That's a sad answer." "It's an honest one," Adewale replied. She nodded slowly. "Maybe, but I think people can always choose differently. Even when life has taught them to be hard, they can choose softness. That's what my mother taught me." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city move around them. For Adewale, these moments had become the most valuable part of the experiment. Not the hunger or the cold or the rejection, but these quiet conversations with someone who expected nothing from him. Halfway into the 30 days, Adewale found himself dreading the end of the experiment. He had found something here, sitting on broken pavements and sleeping under bridges, that he had never found in boardrooms and mansions. He had found someone who saw him, but he also knew it was built on a lie. Zainab didn't know who he really was. And the thought of what would happen when she found out terrified him more than any business deal ever had. One evening, rain poured heavily, catching Adewale without shelter. He had been resting near a closed shop when the skies opened up, turning the streets into rivers within minutes. The rain was cold and relentless, soaking through his thin clothes in seconds. He took shelter under a leaking shop canopy, but it offered little protection. Hours passed and the streets emptied. Vendors packed up and ran home. Cars splashed through puddles, drenching anyone foolish enough to be outside. Just when he thought he would spend the night soaked and shivering, Zainab appeared, holding an umbrella and wearing a concerned expression. "Whale, you can't stay here like this. Come with me." She insisted he follow her to a nearby shelter run by a small community group. It was a modest building with peeling paint and a leaking roof, but it was dry and safe. Other people were there, families displaced by flooding, workers who couldn't get home. A woman at the shelter gave Adewale a towel and a cup of hot tea. Zainab stayed with him, making sure he was okay, before she finally prepared to leave. As they sat waiting for the rain to ease, she spoke about faith, about believing that people were more than their circumstances. She told him about a time she almost lost the bookshop when debts piled up and landlords threatened eviction. She could have given up, but something in her refused to let go. "I think we're all fighting invisible battles," she said quietly. "And sometimes, just knowing someone sees you fighting is enough to keep going." Adewale listened, feeling something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. For the first time in his life, someone cared whether he would be okay tomorrow. Not because of what he could give them, but simply because he existed. As the days drew closer to the end, Adewale faced a growing fear. What if revealing the truth destroyed everything? What if the moment Zainab knew who he really was, she became like everyone else? What if the disappointment in her eyes erased every genuine moment they had shared? He thought about walking away, ending the experiment quietly and never seeing her again. It would be cleaner that way, safer, but it would also be cowardly, and Adewale had spent 30 days learning that real connection required courage. The 28th day arrived quietly. Adewale had made his decision. He couldn't leave without telling her the truth. Not after everything. He asked Zainab to meet him near the bookshop after closing hours. She arrived with her usual warm smile, carrying 2 bottles of malt drink she had bought from a nearby shop. "You sounded serious," she said, handing him one. "Is everything okay?" Adewale looked more nervous than he ever had in any business meeting. His hands shook slightly as he opened the bottle, not from cold but from fear. "Zainab, I need to tell you something, and I'm afraid of what will happen when I do." She sat down beside him, her expression shifting to concern. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." So he did. He told her everything. About his real name, Adewale Adebayo, about his family, the oil fortune, the glass mansion overlooking the Atlantic, about the emptiness he felt despite having everything, about the experiment, the 30 days on the streets, the desperate need to find someone who would see him as more than his bank account. He told her about the woman at the dinner party, the overhead conversation, the years of rehearsed relationships and conditional love. He explained why he had lied about his name, why he needed to know what life looked like from the bottom. When he finished, he waited for anger, for disbelief, for betrayal, for the inevitable change in her eyes that would tell him he had lost her before he ever really had her. Instead, Zainab sat quietly for a long moment, processing. Then she asked him one simple question. "Were you ever honest with me about who you are inside?" Adewale nodded, his throat tight. "Everything I told you about how I felt, about what I believed, that was real. The only lie was my circumstances." She smiled, not with excitement about his wealth, but with something deeper, understanding perhaps, or relief. "Whale, or Adewale, or whatever you want me to call you," she began carefully, "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't change things. It does, but not in the way you might think." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Money doesn't scare me. My mother raised me around people with wealth and people with nothing, and she taught me that neither one determines character. What scares me is deception. What scares me is building something on a foundation that isn't real. But," she continued, "I also understand why you did it. And honestly, the man I've been talking to these past weeks, the one who listened to my stories and shared his fears, that man is who I care about. I don't care if he signs checks or sleeps under bridges. I care that he's honest with me from now on." Adewale felt tears threatening, something that hadn't happened since his mother died. "You're not angry?" "I'm processing," she admitted. "But I'm not angry. I'm hopeful, actually, because you trusted me with the truth. That means something." They talked for hours that night, about what came next, about the challenges of bridging two very different worlds, about whether what they had found could survive outside the bubble of those 30 days. Zainab made one thing clear. She wouldn't be swept into his world and transformed into someone she wasn't. She had her bookshop, her community, her identity. If they were going to build something, it would have to honor both of their lives. Adewale agreed without hesitation. For the first time, someone was setting terms that had nothing to do with his wealth and everything to do with mutual respect. That night, Adewale returned to his world. The gates opened slowly, as if reluctant to let him back in. The lights came on automatically, illuminating spaces that suddenly felt too large, too empty. His staff greeted him with relief and questions he wasn't ready to answer. But he was no longer the same man who had walked out 30 days earlier. The first thing he did was call a meeting with his board. He announced new initiatives, funding for homeless shelters, not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that actually helped people. Investments in small businesses run by people who reminded him of Zainab. People who fought every day to keep their dreams alive. He started visiting the communities he had slept among, not as a savior, but as someone who had learned from them. He listened to their stories, hired people who others had written off, created programs that offered dignity along with assistance. Weeks later, Adewale was seen publicly again, but differently. At an event for small business owners, Zainab stood beside him, not as decoration, but as an equal partner. She had refused to close her bookshop, insisted on maintaining her independence, but agreed to explore what they could build together. People talked, of course. Society pages wondered about the modest bookshop owner who had captured the attention of one of Lagos's most eligible bachelors. Some criticized her, calling her calculating. Others criticized him, saying he was slumming. But Adewale and Zainab didn't care. They had found something rare, a connection built on truth, tested by adversity and strengthened by mutual respect. The lessons stayed with Adewale forever. Love that is real doesn't need proof of wealth. It only needs truth. And truth, he learned, is the most valuable thing a person can offer. His mother had been right all along. Real love was the only thing money couldn't buy, but it was also the only thing worth having. If this story made you think differently about love, kindness, or the masks people wear, drop a comment below telling me which country you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Hit that bell icon so you're notified every time we post.